Alright there, guys. It's Devin from Magewright. Today we're going to talk about how to play spellcasters. This guide's more about the mentality behind playing a spellcaster and how to make, better decisions and kind of put you on the right path to playing it. I see a lot of people struggle with the play style and building up spellcasters. I'll do a little bit of build stuff with spellcasters, but really this is mostly about how to play them and kind of set you on the right way of how to build and play them as well. But mostly the playstyle. Now, I'm not saying my mentality is 100% correct on this, but I've played a lot of successful spellcasters over the years, and this should be a pretty great starting point. There's going to probably be some helpful tips in here for people who have decent experience as well with casters, but this is mostly for basic stuff, but you will have stuff in here that is useful for people who have only played them a few times, or maybe just a few knowledge gaps in people who have played them a decent bit. This is just kind of a good way to start the game with a solid set of knowledge or whatever, on how to pick your spells, how to fight in certain encounters, what to prepare for, and etc. Kind of stuff like that, and how everything kind of works with the caster when you're making your decisions and stuff. So to start off with, when you're picking your caster, you're gonna kind of have to figure out if you're a 4th level caster, like a paladin, which is kind of barely a caster. Spells are kind of just more of a little small addition to your character. 6th level caster, you're kind of getting to a point at this point where you could actually almost build pure caster with this, but it wouldn't be ideal for most characters. This is kind of like Maguses, Inquisitors, War Priests, so you have a decent spell list, but spells are still kind of more like a part of your class. You could get away with a pure caster with this, but it would require some work. And then you get into 9th level casters, which are pretty much it's how you play the game, really, as a full caster. Not every 9th level caster needs to be all about their spells. You could totally build the druid to be about wild shaping, with spells being more about buffing and healing, etc. But it's generally speaking, if you're like a witch or a wizard or something like that, you're gonna be all into your spells. And you can totally do it with druids, clerics, etc. as well. And that's kind of where I'm going to be kind of assuming where you're at, and I'll kind of make a little bit of talking about if you're not into that kind of stuff. But this is mostly on how to kind of play a caster in the backline sort of situation. Not necessarily as much for clerics and druids who are kind of frontline. But there's a little bit of stuff in here that's helpful for that. Alright, so we're going to talk about general builds. So this is kind of just a really rough outline of how I almost always will build my casters, especially if they're a witch or a wizard or something that's very backline focused, or a pure spellcaster. This isn't quite as important all the way if you're a battle cleric or something like that. That's kind of going to be your situation. If you're a battle cleric or a druid or something like that, it won't be as important, or maybe an inquisitor, but even a magus could kind of benefit from this, though they get a lot of this stuff for free anyway. So, my general recommendation when you build your character, for a sorcerer or a witch or etc., is you're going to want to max your casting stat generally, or at least get an 18 with the racial then. I wouldn't take anything less than that if you're going to be all about your spells. But even the 20 is worth considering, even if you're running 15.5. But I could see why you might want to run 18, and it wouldn't break your character or anything. It makes it a little less awkward. 20 is pretty huge because it gives you an extra level 1 spell, more DCs, etc., and concentration. So that's why I really, really recommend trying to run for that. So then the next thing you want to do is you want to build for concentration so we can cast defensively. So we're going to be looking for some traits, items, and feats. I'll go into that a little bit later on, what you're going to want for that. But it's pretty important, I would definitely say. You're also going to want some spell penetration feats for getting past spell resistance. These might be skippable if you think that your setting won't have this come up, but most settings usually do. It usually definitely becomes a problem later on in the game, and there's not a lot of ways to increase spell pen, so it's usually pretty worthwhile to kind of invest into this. Usually you're really only going to be grabbing spell penetration feats. There's not usually a lot of ways beyond that to increase that. The next thing is you kind of want to decide what you're going to be focusing on. If you're, a witch, you're probably going to be looking at more towards, crowd control and insta-death, debuffing. You could do a little bit of buffing and have a little bit of damage, but their spell lists don't really deal well with that. They can also heal decently, too. And there's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of the other stuff, but you're going to kind of want to pick, probably 2 things and just kind of work on being really good at that. Or being really good at one thing and being kind of hey, I'm pretty good at this, and then maybe having a little bit of stuff on the side for other stuff. Summoning's also a viable option as well. I kind of forgot to include that in there. but you're going to want to kind of pick what you want to be. So like a battle cleric is going to be all about healing and buffing, as another example. A wizard can kind of just pick whatever they want to go into. So there's a lot of options there. So you really want to decide kind of what you want to spec your character into, because then you're going to need to take feats like spell focus and grabbing other feats and items that are going to make that all better. Most of your stuff as a caster is going to be contested against your spell DC. So generally an enemy will have to use their saving throw versus your spell DC. So the higher your casting stat is and the more of these feats you have to enhance the right spell school, the harder it is to resist what you're dealing with. Now, not everything has a spell save, but most things do. So like if you're a buffer, you're not really going to worry about this, or somebody who just heals. But pretty much every other thing is going to need to invest into getting their DCs higher. So this is something to really, really consider. And this is why I kind of really push to kind of focus on one or two things, because if you're really good at those one or two things, it means that your DCs are going to be much higher. Well, not much higher, but probably 2 to 4 points higher, which still matters later on in the game. Absolutely. So, now we're going to talk about spell list options a little bit. I'm not going to name you guys specific spells particularly. I'm going to kind of be talking about the types of casters and how to make good decisions when you're picking your spells. I'd be happy to do a video on that later if you guys really want me to be like, here's really good specific spells for each class. But if I did that, we'd be here for a long time. And I really kind of more want to get you guys thinking about what's the right mentality when I'm picking my spells, and how do I make good decisions? Because I very often see people just pick spells and they don't really think about it, or they overlap really hard on the same kinds of spells, or spells that just don't really add a lot. So that's kind of where we're going to be going into this a little bit more. Okay, so there's a few categories of spellcasting. We're going to kind of break this up a little bit. There's divine casters and arcane casters. And then both of those categories have spontaneous and prepared casters. And we'll be talking about them a bit because they're a bit different for each kind of the casters. Prepared is a bit different for divines and arcanes, but spontaneous is the same deal for both. So I'm going to kind of explain what the differences are between those two. This is pretty basic stuff, so for people who know how casters work, you're welcome to kind of skip some of this, but there will be little bits of information here that might be useful to you for when you're making your spell decisions. So, arcane casters, generally you'll suffer from arcane spell failure when casting an armor unless you're a specific class that lets you cast while using armor. Often these classes only do light or maybe medium like Bard or Scald or Blood Rager. There's a few that could eventually do heavy like Magus and Steelblood can do it. Steelblood for Blood Rager archetype. But otherwise it's really rare because generally speaking whenever you cast a spell as an arcane character without having a class that lets you do it, you're going to have to roll an arcane spell failure every time. So that means that there's a chance that your spell will just fail. You don't want that. That is not a good situation to be in. There is also feats to alleviate this, but I'll talk about that another day. They're not hard to find. Arcane armor, if you really want to look into something like that, but generally that's specific builds. Alright, next we got divine casters. Divine casters are pretty similar in terms of they just cast the spells and all of that, but the only real big difference, and this is a really nice advantage, divine casters do not suffer from casting issues in armor like arcanes do. So armor doesn't impede them at all. So if you're a divine caster who can only wear light and medium, you could totally do that. And as long as you're proficient, you totally can. And then you could go and take your heavy armor proficiency feat, and you could wear heavy armor, and your spells aren't going to have any issues with that. So it's absolutely worth considering doing that. So that's why divine casters are pretty strong in this front, and they don't necessarily need to be quite as backline as the arcanes do. But still, if you're going all into spellcasting, I still would recommend that you kind of take some of the setup I'm talking about, because eventually there's going to be points where you need to cast spells, or you're going to be in situations where it's really hard to cast. But I'll get into that as we go on. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about prepared spellcasting. So arcane casters learn spells every few levels, and your class will tell you how many. Usually it's like 2, and you get to kind of pick which levels you want to take them from, and etc. But you can also gain them from inscribing more spells into your book or your familiar. These can be copied off of other scrolls or other spell books, as long as you're able to cast that spell for your class and have time to inscribe them, because it does take time. It can also cost you quite a bit of money, because you might have to buy the scrolls or get access to a book by paying somebody. If there's other prepared casters in the group, it's not a bad idea to see if they're willing to let you inscribe off of each other's spell books. because that can kind of help you guys fill up your spell list a bit better, and then you guys can pick different spells, and it just rounds you out better. But generally speaking, most NPCs and things like that won't be comfortable doing that, because if they lose their spellbook or their familiar, you're not going to be able to cast spells until you get it back. So that's not ideal, because basically how a prepared caster works is they have a book of spells that they read every day to memorize, and they need to do that every day so the spell is still in their head. So if they lose that, it's gone. At least for arcanes anyway. Divines, on the other hand, get it much easier. They just kind of pray to their god every day, and they can swap all of their spells. They just know them all. The gods just zip it into their head, and they know the spell. Once again, another kind of advantage for divines. Kind of a little weird, but ultimately not a huge deal. But it definitely helps out quite a bit. So yeah, they can just swap all of their spells every day, whereas the other arcane ones can only pick to swap their spells that are in their books. However, prepared casters can just swap spells every day when they get up, and they can just change up their whole list as long as it's in their spellbook, or if you're divine, you can pick whatever you want on your spell list. So, pretty big advantage there, so there's a lot of adaptability. Downside compared to spontaneous, though, they don't cast as many spells per day as spontaneous, but spontaneous don't have as many options. And one last thing, sorry, I meant to mention about prepared casters is I would generally recommend that you kind of don't pick a damage focused character with the spell types, because they run out of steam a lot quicker. They're a lot better at being able to have the right spell for the right situation with versatility and using CC and buffs and debuffs and utility to get through encounters. Having a little bit is never bad, absolutely. But you'd be better off probably going spontaneous and just picking a couple of really good damage spells if you want to go that route, because they can cast more of them. They just aren't able to swap with that utility that you have. So this works better with like debuffers and instant deaths and buffs and etc. These are spells that get you a lot more bang for your buck with one cast than just tossing a fireball. Now this is kind of related to spontaneous, because I want to go through this as well really quick, sorry. Read all your spells. Like, I would just go through a book and I'd read all the spells. You're never going to remember them all, but you can at least get an idea and kind of mark things that are interesting and for situations that might come up. And I'd reread them like once in a while if you're really dedicated to the game. Obviously, people who are only really like super invested in the game are going to spend this amount of time, but this is still really impactful, because if you know what all your spells do, then you can have a bunch of different answers to situations that will crop up. Now, also, when you're picking your spells, I really recommend you pick them based on this. You should pick spells that target different things. So, pick a spell that targets a reflex save. Pick a spell that targets a will save. Pick one that targets a fortitude save. The reason is because, like, if all of your spells target reflex, then if you get into a fight with a rogue, you're going to be useless. Like, you just are. And there's not a lot you can do about it. However, if you got a spell that does fortitude or will save in your back pocket or whatever, chances are pretty good that rogue does not have very good saves in those aspects. Or at least one of those two will be lower. So that'll help you out a lot. It's really important you want to have versatility in your spell choices when you're against opponents like that, because you're going to need to have a different spell for a different opponent. And you're going to be able to choose a lot more different spells. It's also really important that you look at what your spell requires, because every spell usually can need one of the three things of verbal, somatic, or material. So it's important to know what these all work. I'll kind of go into those a little bit later and what they kind of are and what they symbolize. But this can save you a lot of bad spots in the game. So as an example, would be Dimension Door is verbal, and it's nothing else. So a possibility if you're pinned in making a high enough concentration check, which I'll be going into later, is really effective, because if you can roll that concentration check and your mouth is still usable, like they haven't pinned your mouth or shoved it full of something or etc., you're able to Dimension Door right out of that grapple, which is huge. You know, having Glitter Dust as a level 2 spell, that's will saves. Web for reflex. Blindness and Deafness for fortitude. These are all level 2 spells. So this means that I have tons of options for dealing with opponents. It's really, really effective, and I really recommend that you go through your spell list and make good picks that target different things on different characters. If you're all focused on one kind of saving throw, you're going to meet somebody who's going to give you a really bad time. So I really recommend that you try to make that list as versatile as possible. There's also things for AC, like with range touches as well. Sometimes those things have a follow-up save with them, but still can be really useful, and some of them just do damage. So, now I'm going to actually get into spontaneous casting. I know I've been baiting that for a while, but now we're going to get into it. So, spontaneous casters are arguably easier to learn initially, I would say. But the big problem with them is they can't adapt as well as prepared casters. They can cast more spells per day, but they have the second table where they only get to know so many spells in a day. So, I can only learn Magic, Missile, and Shield. I can cast that 6 times, and I can swap in between whatever I want. But once I cast 6 level 1 spells, I can't cast either of those anymore, and I can't swap those anymore. Like, those are the spells that I know. Now, you can swap spells, like, on most spontaneous casters. I don't know if this is every single one, but I know the Oracles and Sorcerers can certainly do this. I suspect it's probably all of them. So starting at level 4, you're able to swap out your spells every time you level. Well, only one of your spells, sorry, I should stand corrected on that. So every time you level, I'm able to swap out one of my spells, no. So it's a lot more difficult to deal with than, say, the Wizard who can swap them out every single day. It's simpler, but you don't have the versatility, so if you have spells that you don't like or end up becoming really useless throughout the campaign, it takes you a lot longer to fix them, or have spells that are really useful in every situation. So that's why when I play a spontaneous caster, I really recommend that instead of picking all of, like, the super, super different and niche spells that I kind of recommended, I would pick more generalized, these spells are good most of the time spells. Wizards can kind of afford to be very, like, I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to prepare this kind of niche spell for this encounter that we've gathered information on. But sorcerers can't really do that. They need to pick spells that are good most of the time. So that's something that you really got to kind of watch out for. I still recommend trying to pick things that target different saves and things like that. Absolutely. But you don't necessarily want to target something that only works on, like, oh, this only works on undead and this only works on constructs of the sorcerer, because what are you going to do when you don't run into those things afterwards, right? So it's really important to watch out for that. So, like I said, the big bonus with spontaneous is it's easier to learn, and then also you get to cast more spells per day. So if you're looking for a character that just blasts things or uses the same, several solutions to deal with every encounter, this works really, really well. And it does add things. Like, obviously, like, for example, 3rd level spell you always want to take, haste. Like, if you always have haste in your back pocket, that's a win. So that's a really kind of good way to go about it. Okay, so we're going to talk about how people cast spells now. So every spell kind of has a component that you need to cast it. It's somatic, material, and verbal. Every spell usually needs 1 to 3 of these to cast. There is ways to kind of get around that, but it is really, really awkward and difficult. Well, not necessarily difficult, but it's costly. So it's important to know when these come up, because somatic needs hands, or it needs a hand free to do the gestures. So if you have, one weapon in your hand or whatever, the other one's free, you're good to go. Or if you even have a two-hander nowadays, you can do that as long as you can, take that down for just a second. However, if it's like, I have a long sword and I have a shield and I can't move my hands around at all, then somatic kind of becomes out of the question for you, unless you're a specific class with, like, a bond or something like that. They can get away with channeling it through, like, their weapon or something on their person. I think Arcane Duelist on Bard or whatever can do that as an example. I think Wizard might be able to get away with that too, if they choose the right thing at level 1. So this is really important because, as an example, if you're pinned and unable to move, with the example that I gave to Dimension Door earlier, so if you're pinned and your mouth is stuffed, as an example, you could theoretically use the Silence Spell, which is a meta magic which will increase the cost of the spell, and you need a fee for it. However, that would take away the verbal component of the spell, and you could theoretically be rolling your concentration check to cast that and get out of the grapple. This is a really useful thing to do. I would highly recommend in some cases, because it means the Dimension Door is almost always an option, unless there's a dimensional anchor in the area or something like that. But that's getting into some wacky stuff later on in the game. But having stuff like that in your back pocket to get at things is very effective. This is also important because some materials are really, really expensive. Or if you're in a situation where, maybe you're taken into prison, you're not going to have your materials on you. You're a wizard, they're going to take them off of you. A sorcerer, they'll have SQ materials, so dirt cheap materials they can do without. As long as it's up to a certain gold price, you're fine. So, just as a thing. Another thing to keep in mind is make sure you pay attention to what kind of action your spell takes to cast. Some spells most of them take a standard, some take a full round, and there are spells that exist out there that do take multiple rounds. So it's really important to watch out for that. So sometimes if a spell looks really good, there might be a reason for that because of that. So watch out for that, just so you don't end up making a mistake when you're playing the game. Okay, so I want to talk about the mentality to playing a caster. So this is kind of where I talk about play style. So it's a different playstyle that people kind of have to learn to deal with, and it's sometimes really tricky. So if you're a cleric or another divine character that gets armor, or maybe one of the other arcanes that doesn't have to sit in the back, it's pretty easy and it's not quite as bad to deal with. And even later in the game, you can have reasonably solid defenses, but early on, you're not bad, and you can kind of take some risk with combat casting, and usually you have other things in your back pocket that aren't necessarily just spellcasting. Witches and wizards and things like that, and arcanists don't necessarily always have that option. So, the big thing I'm going to be talking about initially is boosting your casting defensively ability. Now, I kind of want to talk about casting defensively because this is really important. Lots of people don't know that this exists. At least initially. And if they do it wrong, which is really awkward. So casting defensively is pretty chill. Basically, if you're within an attack of opportunity range, you have to make a concentration check of 15 plus double the spell level of the spell that you want to cast. So a level 1 spell would be DC 17, because it's 15 times your spell level 1 to 2. So it'd be 15 plus 2 is 17, and if you do a level 2 spell, then it goes to 19, and etc. So this is really, really effective really important to know, because you're going to want to boost your combat defensive ability to cast to get to a point where it's like a no-fail, basically. And that's kind of what I always want to do. Now, ideally, you could just 5-foot step away and it's no problem or whatever. However, we need to be realistic about this. If you're planning to play a caster and you think that you're never going to have something that gets on top of you to melee you, that is unrealistic. It will happen at some point, and it happens very, very often. You see a guy casting a spell, your enemy's probably going to try to get to you. And then later on in the game, you're going to be dealing with things that are very large, have teleports, have invisibility, have tons of ways to flank you. It's unrealistic. We need to assume that at some point something is going to get on top of us, and we need to have countermeasures for it. That's the biggest thing when you're playing a caster is having countermeasures for as many situations as you can possibly think of. That's why I talked about that dimension door earlier. That's why I talked about all those different spells earlier. You want to have solutions to as many problems as you can think of. And at some point, you're going to run into something that you don't. But you know what? That's okay. Take the lesson and learn from it. And it might be something that comes up that's really, really rare, and it needs to be kind of like, well, what could I have done to fix that? But ideally, yes, we will avoid being in melee as much as possible. However, casting defensively is our fallback if we do get into melee. So if that does happen, we can cast next to somebody by casting defensively. So like I said, it's 15 plus double the spell level for the DC. Now, what do you need to make this? Well, generally speaking, our concentration is usually our caster level plus our casting stat. However, there is ways to boost that. I'm going to get into that in just a second here. So, we're going to boost up concentration really, really hard. This will allow us to cast off spells and all of that with no problems. However, caveat with that, I will say, do not use a ranged touch spell, because that is another attack of opportunity that you cannot get around with casting defensively. So if it's a ranged touch spell like Scorching Ray or something like that where you have to roll and aim it basically, that's a problem. Magic Missile wouldn't be an issue, Blindness Deafness wouldn't be an issue, Web wouldn't be an issue. Spells where there's not an attack roll that you have to aim and cast, you'll be fine. This is really important to memorize. So, here's some things that will boost us. I recommend taking combat casting early on, like level 1 or 3. You can maybe push it to 5, but honestly, I recommend trying to get it reasonably early. This gives us a massive +4 to our concentration. Take Desperate Focus trait for another +2. This is in our traits. It's a magic trait. It's really good. There is other really good magic traits, and you could get away with kind of skimming past this, but it's risky. But if it's something for like magical lineage or one of the other really good magical traits that exist out there, I'd get the risk. And it's possibly worth it. It's kind of going to be dependent on you. The final big ticket item is Spell Guard Bracers for 5,000 gold. This gives another +2, but also 3 times per day you can roll 2 dice and take the highest. This makes it honestly so hard to fail a check and like borderline impossible to fail casting defensively until you get to like some really crazy stuff that's going on. So let's use level 5 as an example that you want to cast defensively to avoid getting tactical casting, say a level 3 spell. So the DC for this is 15 plus double spell level, so 15 plus double 3, so that's 6, so 15 plus 6 is 21. So we'll assume that we have a casting stat of, let's say, 18, but honestly you'd probably be more like 20, but we'll say that, or even 22 with an item. But we're going to just assume that we have the +4 for casting stat. And then we have a 5 for our caster level, so we're at a 9. Then we get 4 for our feat for 13, 2 for the trait for 15, This is with no Spellguard Braces, we're at a 15. Not ideal odds, but definitely not bad. If you didn't have these things in, you'd be like at a 50-50 shot, which is not where you want to be. If you get the spell guards, it could be 17, and if you get the casting stats, you could potentially be more like 19 on this roll, which is like basically a no-fail, especially if you have the 2 rolls. You'd fail on a 1, and you get to roll 2 dice if you have the spell guards, so that's why I really recommend pushing for these as soon as possible. So that also means that even with a 15 or whatever, even if you have that lowercase situation or whatever, your level 1 spells are almost a no-fail. Level 2 is like a 15% chance to fail. That's not bad to be in. I wouldn't want to necessarily always bet on that, but it's a spot where you can at least kind of be okay. If you have the spell guards, you're doing way better, though, and the higher casting stat. Now, you're going to hit a point where you're going to outscale the progression, though, because our casting stat keeps going up, our casting levels keep going up, but the stat does as well. So eventually we're going to outscale that 15 to double spell level. So you're going to be like, probably like, Devin, well, if we're going to outscale it, why are we going so hard on this then? Well, you do need a lot of these to kind of get to that point, but you are going to eventually, you're going to outscale it and overkill it. But the reason why I also recommend outscaling it is because concentration checks aren't just limited to casting defensively. They come up in a lot of other situations, like casting when you're having to move around a lot with vigorous motions, like winds and things like that, or water and stuff. There's a lot of situations where this will come up, but the big, really scary one is going to be when you get grappled. That changes things. So when you get grappled, it's 10 plus your grappler's CMB plus spell level, which later in the game, you can hit some terrifying numbers with this, because if you get grappled by like a really big monster, that's a bad time. You can have checks that get into the 40s with this. I probably even 50s really, really late game, I assume. But I haven't really played around with CMB a whole lot. But being that it's base attack plus like strength and stuff, like, I mean, that's 20 off of a level 20 character later in the game. And I think them having, a 12 strength modifier for even like a human-ish like character is pretty realistic. But like the big monsters can get a lot higher for sure. A 40 is not unreasonable, and even getting into the 50s once you get feats and things included in and size category ups and stuff, it gets out of hand. So if you have this or whatever really late in the game, like, you can hit some pretty crazy numbers yourself. And the Spellguard Bracers on your kind of like in your back there, you can possibly get these situations that you would never be able to get out of, especially with that Dimension Door, and especially if you can get that Silence spell in there. There's other spells too that are really, really good to get out of situations as well. I'm just a big fan of that one, but there's totally other teleports you can take, or you can aim for a Save or Suck spell. Maybe you go for instant death or whatever on that creature, or try to put it to sleep, or etc. There's tons of things you can do. So this is a really good way to kind of go about it. I really recommend you push really hard. This is kind of how you deal with basic melee shenanigans in the game. Casting defensively is kind of the bare bones of how I always make my character. But after that, you do need to pick good spells and have a good idea of how to use and counter and just be effective at using your character, which is going to take time and practice, absolutely. But kind of how I've described how to make my spell choices is really going to help you guys kind of get on that right path for that. And focusing on a couple of these, like, picking CC and debuff or whatever, go hand in hand. If I debuff, then I can CC them easier. Or it also means somebody else in my group potentially could as well. Or make it really challenging to fight a lot easier. Buffing's really good too, damage, etc., summons, whatever you want to kind of throw in there, healing. So this is why I really recommend that you read your spells extensively and try to think of counters to situations that will come up. And if you didn't have a counter to it, look into it. What could you have done? What could you have done differently or had prepared? Is it realistic that you would have this? What do I do when there's a golem? Like, that's a huge problem for most casters, because golems just shake off spells most of the time if they're spell resistance based, but there is spells that do work on them that don't trigger spell resistance. An ooze, something like that or whatever, an undead. Every class has different answers to these situations. Some have huge issues with certain types. Maybe you're going to need an item to fix that issue. Maybe you need to keep a summon in your back pocket for fights that you can't CC very well, or debuff very well. So, I want you to think about where you're going with this. Try to collect as much information from the NPCs when you're playing a game as possible, the environment. Use your knowledge checks. Usually most DMs will have some foreshadowing or info out there for players to investigate and try to get a grasp of what's going on, and then you can kind of sort your spells kind of to regarding that. Especially if you're a prepared caster. Absolutely worth doing. So try to adjust it accordingly on the information somewhat, but I wouldn't change every single thing on the assumption, because sometimes you can have NPCs that may give you slightly wrong info or slightly different situations that arise. So keeping a few generally good spells on hand is always a really good idea. But changing, a spell or two for a niche situation that may come up and have huge, huge winning potential can absolutely be worth it. And there are so many spells in this game and so many uses for them that if you know them well enough, you can do some absolutely incredible things in this game. So I really recommend that you try to be as familiar as possible. Try to take as many versatile spells and know your character as well as you can and be set up for success. Now I want to quickly go over spell penetration really quick, and then I'm kind of going to be at the end of this. Spell penetration is kind of like almost attacking armor class on monsters, but with spells. Not every spell triggers this, and you're going to have to read that in your description for the spell. So it's really important. However, generally speaking, they only use your caster level, and then there are the feats that exist to get you a +4. There are some races that can give you bonuses as well, and a few other things that exist out there to increase that. So the reason you're going to want that is because when you get into fights with things like demons and dragons later on and stuff, and they have spell resistance, it's pretty hard to get past that stuff, because it's usually like 10 plus their hit die. So it gets really hard. So you're going to want to crank up your spell pen as much as possible, because that is something that it is very difficult to get kind of around. Even with a +4 or a +6, there are a lot of situations where those fights could be really difficult. There is also a meta magic called Piercing, which will help with that. That's also worth looking into. I think it shaves it down by like 6 or something. I don't remember off the top of my head. Very helpful. There is other ways to get around things like that. And that's why I really recommend you try to look into your characters as much as possible and try to find things that'll help you get past those tough encounters. And have a good setup for situations that do arise. Because then you can get a rod or whatever, a piercing or whatever. You don't necessarily have to get the meta magic for it. So that's a really effective way to kind of deal with that. And a good example. So, that's all I got for today. If people want some advanced tips for specific classes, or spell choices, or more kind of thoughts on my mentality on casters, I could certainly do another video. I could absolutely do a part 2. This is kind of just a very basic outline of kind of how I play a caster in Pathfinder. I think this is really a solid kind of grasp on how I would play, and kind of a basic introduction, but also with some decent tips in there for people who have only even played casters, a couple times. So, if you got questions, comments, please throw them in the comment section or on my Discord. I'm happy to answer them. If you want more, please throw me a subscription or a like. I really appreciate that. And thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you later.